Tony. Welcome to Sew Lounge. Today we're going to sew Simplicity 9011, which is this super easy knit dress. Now, the reason it's super easy is because there are only 3 pattern pieces to cut out, so it's super fast to cut out. And the second reason it's super easy is that there aren't any darts or any kind of fancy markings. It's just basically a bunch of notches to put your pieces together. Now, I don't sew a lot of knits, not with patterns anyway. I have done some costume knits where I've draped costumes and used knit fabric that way, but for the most part I haven't. Primarily because when I was in college, my professors would always be like, oh, knits are hard, just use plain weave fabrics, it's going to be easier with your design. So as a result, none of us in our program back in the day were taught how to design or really sew with knit fabrics. So we're going to be learning together today, although it's not terribly difficult. We're going to do this together, and this will be one of the first knit patterns I have sewn. And before we get started, make sure that you have your pattern pieces all cut out. This is the back, so that's actually 2 pieces of fabric, and then this is the front, which is on the fold, and then you have a super easy neckband. Now, to go along with this, when you look at the directions, it says to, number 1, use a ballpoint or a stretch needle, so make sure you have some of those needles on hand. They're also called jersey needles, which are for knit fabric. Second, you're going to be sewing with a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch, if your machine has one of those. And third, to prevent the shoulder seams from stretching out, so that's up here as we're working with, and also once you hang it up so that it doesn't just stretch out of shape too bad, you're going to need some hem tape. I read that direction a little bit late, so I am using some flexi lace hem tape that I found in my stash. You can probably use any kind of hem tape that you want. This kind of matches. I'm going to be sewing in black, so it'll all work together. So these patterns are available right now in stores, so you can pick one up and sew along with us wherever you buy your patterns. And to get started, let's go in for a closer look. All right, so this is a close-up of Simplicity 9011, and I am making dress A, but I've kind of shortened it, so it's not quite as short as B, but it's not as long as A. It's kind of more just below the knee length, because that is what I wanted. There's also 2 other variations, B and C, which have different types of sleeves, and they're in the same kind of length. So this is kind of a midi length, which is a weird length for me, so I don't wear that length dress or skirt, but if it works for you, go ahead and go for it. So looking at the pattern instructions, the parts that I just enumerated are up here, which is about using the right needle for sewing knits, using the right stitch, which is either going to be a zigzag stitch or a stretch stitch, and then using hem tape along the shoulder edges so that the shoulders don't stretch once we hang them up. So the thing about this pattern that's awesome is it's basically a center back seam and then shoulder seams. And then you basically do the underarm seams and then you hem the sleeves in the bottom. It's super fast. So we're going to be working with that. It's going to be pretty easy. And let's get started by pinning the center back seam together, matching the notches, and then we're going to stitch. So we're starting with step 1, which is putting in the center back seam. Now, when I cut out my fabric, I cut it out with the right sides together. So if you have a knit fabric and you're not sure which side is the right side, whichever side the knit is rolling towards is the right side. So when you cut it, usually the bottom will roll a little bit, and if whatever side it rolls to, that's the front of your fabric. So you want to pin the fronts together, put the fronts together and then pin along the side so that that outside fabric is on the correct side. We are going to make sure that these center back notches are lined up, and remember that on the center back, you know it's the center back seam because there's 3 notches in there, and we are going to just put in a pin at that point. These are still kind of stuck together from when I cut them out. Which is another beauty of knit. It kind of likes to stick to itself a little bit. So just put in some pins along that stitch line, however many as you like, whatever makes you comfortable. and then go down this whole edge, just lining everything up. And don't stretch the fabric as you pin it. You just kind of want to let it line up with itself and then just put in a pin, because we don't want to stretch it while we're handling it or while we're sewing it, because we don't want to have lumps or any kind of weird stretching going on during the sewing process, because then once it relaxes and it's not being sewn, you're either going to have kind of a curved seam or a puckered seam, and we don't want to do that. So, all right, I've got all my pins in, and let's head over to the sewing machine. So I'm at the sewing machine, and initially I had planned to use a stretch stitch to sew the center back seam, and I did that, and I made some videos about it, and it made a big chunky back seam that kind of stood up by itself, and we don't want that on the center back. That'll be a stitch that'll be fine to use for the arms and probably not the shoulders, because we don't want those to be standing up either. But for the underarm seam, we could totally do that one if we want, and Clementine has come to help out with the stretch knit video today. And so we are just going to be sewing with a zigzag stitch. So now that we're doing a zigzag stitch, let's move the cat. Come on, get down. Make sure you test out the length and the width of the stitch with your fabric and get a setting that you like for the length and the width. So I am going to set my machine to a 3, 2.5. So width of 3, length of 2.5. That should be good for what I'm doing. And let's go in for a closer look. All right, so I've got everything lined up, and the thing about sewing knit fabrics is that you need to make sure you're not pulling them or stretching them while you're sewing. So we just want to get everything lined up, and we're just gonna let the machine run the fabric through with the feed dogs and everything. So you're not stretching, you're just kind of holding it in place to make sure everything stays lined up. And we are sewing at 5/8 of an inch, because that is what the pattern says to sew at. And I'm just going to remove the pen as I get to it. And then I have the weight of my dress on my lap, and the sleeve going off over here to the side where you can't see on a table, because like I said, we don't want to stretch out our fabric. We just want to sew it so that we have a nice smooth and flat seam. Now we're coming down to the bottom hem edge of the skirt, and I'm just going to sew over that. We don't need to backstitch. And then with my needle, raise my presser foot, and you can see we have a nice zigzag stitch. Once we open that fabric, let me zoom out a little bit. There we go. So once we open up that seam, we just have a normal looking seam, but it does have some more stretch to it than if we sewed it with a straight stitch. And on the added bonus, we can go back in and press open these seams or press them over to one side to reduce that bulk in that center back seam. Let's keep going. So now that we've got the center back seam sewn together, we're going to pin the front piece together with the back piece at the shoulder seams, because that's going to be the next seam that we sew. And per the instructions, we are supposed to put the hem tape along this shoulder seam prior to sewing it together. So pin it in place, and then we're going to sew it all together. And it also said to put it on the front panel piece. So we want to make sure that it's on the inside of the seam. So put it on the outside of the garment, because we're going to be pinning these together, right sides together, and then we're going to sew the seam. So as we pin, and actually I think I'm going to line up the notches first, because I think that's going to be easier. And once that notch is lined up, then I'm going to go and put the hem tape from the neckline back along that notch, and I'm going to put in a pin, and then I'm going to move my notch pin as well to just hold that lace in place a little bit better. Let's go in for a closer look. All right, so we have this seam all pinned in. As you can see, the notches are matched, and then we are going to go back in with the hem tape and line it up along the edge and then pin that in. It's a little bit easier to do it this way because then you're not, you know, trying to get everything all matched up while you were trying to get this hem tape in. So just pin everything in place. And some hem tape is iron in. This is what I had, and it is not, but you could also just iron that in before you pin the seams together if that's easier. If you were using the clear elastic, you cannot iron that in, so don't make that mistake. But once everything is pinned in, I'm just gonna put another pin in here because it's kind of moving a little bit. Then we are gonna head over to the sewing machine and sew in this top shoulder seam. So all of my machine settings are the same. We have not changed anything. We're still doing a zigzag stitch. I'm going to take out this first pin, make sure that my hem tape is all lined up. I drop my presser foot. We will be stitching inside of this seam where the hem tape is. So to get started, I'm going to roll my needle down and just start stitching, making sure everything is lined up. And just removing the pins as I get to them. And you can slow down once you get down to the other end and just finish it out. Okay. So I have my seam, my shoulder seam all sewn in, and my hem tape is secured in there to give that shoulder seam a little bit more support. Go ahead and sew the other side, and then I will meet you back at the cutting table. So the next step is to make the neckband, which is just basically taking this single piece. If you cut it out on folded fabric, you're gonna have two of these. You might be confused. We're only using one. The directions said to only cut one. I ended up cutting two, but now I've got an extra in case I mess one up. So we want to fold the length in half, and there's going to be a notch at that end. That is going to be how we start to sew the collar together, or the neckband together. And I'm just gonna stick a pin in here, and we're gonna head over to the sewing machine. And then next we are going to be folding this down and then attaching it to the neck hole to finish it off. Let's head to the sewing machine. 1/4 inch, so I have everything lined up, and we're still using all the same settings like before. I'm gonna roll my needle in and start stitching. So I've got that end, and now we've got a nice closed loop for our neckband. Once your neckband is sewn together, first thing we're going to do is press open that seam so it's going to be a little bit more manageable. I do have my iron on a polyester setting. I do not know what kind of fabric this is. I think it's a cotton poly blend because it doesn't feel like straight cotton, so we're going to err on the side of caution and use a poly setting on the iron instead of cotton. Now, the next step is going to be to fold the wrong sides together. So that means we're folding along the seam we just sewn, and then we want to pin and press. It actually says press first, but I think it might be easier if we pin it. Let's see. Let's try the method of the instructions. So we're going to just fold it in half, and this might be a little bit dangerous, so you might want to pin first and then come back. There we go. Once we get started, it's not too bad. So I'm just going to go around the neckband, folding it in half and pressing it. So it's easier to work with once we go over to attach it to the neckline. So this is just a close-up view of what we have done so far. We have sewn the neckband together, we have folded it in half and pressed it, and now we're getting ready to move on to step number 6, where we are going to pin the neckband to the outside of the neck edge, matching everything up, and then we're going to stitch it before we flip it to then finish the neckline. So the next step is going to be to attach the neckband to the neck hole or the neckline. So we are going to be starting with the center back seam, and we are pinning to the outside of the garments. We're pinning on the right side of the garment, and then we're going to stitch it, and then we're going to flip. So that's why this may seem a little bit weird, but that's what we're doing. So I'm just going to pin through all these layers of seams at the center back, which is getting kind of chunky, but that's okay. We have a zigzag stitch to help us out. And then the next part is that the dots that we marked onto the neck band need to match the side seams. Now to do that, you're going to have to stretch. So if you match the side seam, match the dots to the side seams first. Mine are on the inside, so I have to unfold it a little bit to see where they went. Okay, they're there. So once you find your dots, you want to put the dot on the side seam. Really? Honey? You want to put your dot on the side seam, and then you're going to put a pin in to hold that seam open and hold that dot in place. And then you're going to come back around. You can see how you're going to have to stretch to make it fit. So we're just going to stretch the neckline. We're stretching the band to fit the neckline because there's more fabric on the neckline than there is on the band. So we want to stretch that out and line everything up. Honey's a good watchdog. And then we're going to put some pins in. And then we're going to repeat that on the other shoulder before we go around to the front. So find your dots, line them up on that shoulder seam. Make sure that seam is open so you're not going to be sewing any of that part of it closed. And then we're going to go back and stretch the neckband to fit the neckline. And if you look at the notes on the pattern piece, it actually does say stretch on part of it. Well, that's what it means. You're going to be stretching it because you need to fit it together. So now I'm just going to go around to the front. Everything on the front is going to line up because you stretched it on the back to make it fit. So just flip it around, line up that front band, and once you're finished, we'll head back to the sewing machine. All right, so now we're at the sewing machine, and this is one of those times when you want to make sure that your free arm is open. If you have a little table around it, take that off so you can access this free arm. We're going to be sewing the neckline and to be going around. We're going to be sewing the neckline to go around the free arm, and so that's why you need it up out of the table or with the platform removed. So next we need to make sure that our magnetic seam gauge is in the right place. We're going to be sewing at 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to grab my little gauge and measure 3/8, which is going to be just one line past the outside edge of the presser foot. So I'm going to get that all lined up. And next, make sure that your machine settings are where they need to be. I am sewing with a zigzag stitch, so making sure that my settings are all the same as before. And we are going to be starting with the center back seam. As usual, it's a good place to start when you're sewing in the round. And it's a little bit chunky, so make sure all those seam allowances are open and going in the right direction, so you're not creating even more bulk than usual. And so I'm going to start a little bit in front of that seam, take this pin out, and I'm going to lower the presser foot. And then now we've got everything lined up, and I'm ready to start sewing. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to be pulling gently as I sew, but not too hard. I just want everything to line up and keep those two edges flush with one another. So just a little bit of a stretch, not anything crazy. And let's start stitching. You may be wondering why there's no machine sound. It's because this part of the video audio did not record, and so I'm doing a voiceover. So bear with me. It's a little strange to not hear the sewing machine, but to be watching it. So we are just sewing along. And you can kind of see how the fabric is, there's a little bit of a pucker here. And let's show you how it's doing that. We're going to have to stretch it a little bit to make those two edges line up because the dress part is a little bit bigger. Let's go in a little bit closer. There we go. So you can see that, and we just want those to line up. So by pulling that, we can get everything nice and even and line up those outside edges. So just make sure that everything's lined up as you're sewing because we don't want to have any puckers while along the neckline or anywhere else for that matter. So we're still going around, and this is why we're sewing in the round. We want to make sure that all of our seams stay open as we get to them. And so I'm just still sewing, pulling a little bit, keeping those edges lined up, and we are just going around. Now, as we're coming to the shoulder seam, we want to make sure that these seams are open and lying flat so that we sew them flat instead of them bunching up. So just make sure as you're sewing that you're keeping those flat and smooth while still keeping the outside edge all lined up. So just double check. You can slow down through this part, making sure everything is still lined up. And then that's why you're moving it around the free arm, is just so that it's a little bit easier. So just keep sewing and stretching until you get back to the center back seam. We're coming up to the other shoulder seam. So just go around and make sure all those notches are lined up, that those seams are open. It's kind of the same as usual as if we were sewing a regular fabric garment, but we're still stretching a tiny bit. So just keep going, and once you finish, we'll move on to the next step. So this is the finished stitch line, as you can see, and next we are going to be sewing in that second stitch line so that that edge will be a little bit tighter, so when we flip it over, that's what the finished outside of the collar is going to look like. So we're just going to go back around again using a straight stitch. Now the patterns say you can use a straight stitch for both of these, but I just did a zigzag stitch first. I'm going to do a straight stitch for the second one, and it's supposed to be 1/8 of an inch from the edge. So I'm going to take off the seam gauge because I don't need it anymore, because 1/8 of an inch away from the 3/8 is going to be the 1/4 inch mark, and that is the edge of the presser foot. So I'm going to get my threads just all straight, get this all lined up, still starting at the center back seam, and lower that presser foot, and we are just going to be sewing a straight stitch all the way around, and it's a little bit over from that zigzag stitch, as you can see. So we're just sewing that in and going around, and that's pretty much it. It's already sewn, so it's not quite as complicated as making sure everything's open. So just finish sewing and we'll move on to the next step. So we're just continuing to sew around, and we're coming up to that center back seam. I'm going to lift my presser foot, cut off those thread tails, and this is what the finished seams should look like. Now I have a zigzag stitch along with a straight stitch. You may have 2 straight stitches, but next we are going to flip the collar right side out, and then we're going to stitch on that outside edge. So we're back at the ironing board, and this time we're going to be pressing this neckband towards the inside of the garment. That's going to create a nice little kind of like standing knit neckband. So we're pressing the seam we just sewed towards the inside of the garment. So I have my garment turned inside out, and I'm just going to come over here to this edge because it makes it a little bit easier to get everything pressed and flipped. My iron is set to polyester because I'm not sure what kind of fabric this is. I think it's a poly cotton blend. And I am just going to apply steam and press this seam that we just sewed to the inside of the garment, and that's going to make that outside edge stand up a little bit. So you can just work that around the end of your ironing board until it's lying nice and smooth. Don't forget to let it cool after you press, and use steam, but be careful that you don't burn yourself. And that should be the last stretch. And then if you want, you can flip it to the right side of the garment and press it again from that right side, just to make it really nice and stiff and crisp for when we go back and sew from the right side of the garment, to just finish up that last step of the neckband. One other tip, since we are here at the ironing board right now, this would be a really great time to press open the seams on the rest of your dress. You know, I pressed open the top part when we were doing the neckline, but I'm going to go through and press the rest of it. That way, after I finish the neck, I can just do the side seams and finish the sleeves and the hem and not have to come back to the ironing board. So totally up to you as to when you want to do this part of the process, but I'm just going to do it now. And once you're finished pressing, I'll meet you back at the sewing machine. So we're back at the sewing machine, and this time around we are stitching from the right side. As you can see, we've got the little neckband that's standing up. Let me find the center, that's a sleeve. Here we are at center back. So I'm still starting at center back. I think it's easy to do that. And according to the directions, we should stitch as close to the stitch line as possible. So I'm gonna do about 1/8 of an inch. On my machine, that's that first little mark right here. And I have my machine set to a straight stitch. If you didn't switch it over to do the straight stitch for the whole collar, then do that now. So I'm just gonna get everything lined up, and I'm just gonna start stitching. And we're just coming back around to the center back. And move this thread out of the way, there we go. And I'm just going to continue to stitch over that a little bit, and that'll lock those threads together without having to back stitch. Okay, lift up that presser foot. I'm going to cut off those tails, and as you can see now, we have a nice finished neckband, and it actually looks really good. I'm really proud of that. So you should be proud of yours too.